The alarm started before I even reached my chair. I am Edmund Voss, Senior Coordinator to the Galactic Council, and on the morning everything changed, I was holding a cup of untouched tea, while 3 different screens flashed the same impossible word. Gone. Not delayed. Not damaged. Gone. 41 human vessels had been stationed across our shared border zones that week, holding back raiders, watching choke points, doing the quiet work nobody else wanted. By the time I sat down, every single one of them had vanished from orbital tracking. No distress signal, no farewell, no warning shot across anyone's bow. Just empty space where steel and quiet competence used to be. My aide, a sharp young council clerk named Felicity Marsh, burst into my office without knocking, which she never did. Her hands were shaking around a data slate. "Coordinator Voss," she said, "the humans are leaving. All of them. Every outpost, every embassy, every ship. It's happening right now." I told her to slow down, to check her sources, because surely this was a drill, a misunderstanding, a clerical error blown out of proportion. She set the slate on my desk and let the footage speak, instead of her voice. 17 separate sensor feeds, from 17 separate sectors, all showing the same thing. Human ships folding their formations, turning as one, and sliding into transit corridors without requesting clearance, without filing a single flight plan, without saying a single word to anyone. I want to tell you I felt nothing but professional concern in that moment, the kind any coordinator might feel when an allied fleet repositions unexpectedly. That would be a lie. What I felt, sitting in that chair with my tea going cold, was a kind of silence inside my own chest, as if something large and warm had just stepped out of a room I hadn't realized it was holding up. Let me explain how we got here, because none of this happened in a single morning. It happened over years, in small decisions, in dismissed warnings, in 1,000 moments where the Council chose convenience over respect. Humanity arrived in Council space 11 years before that morning, and I remember the first briefing about them clearly, because I laughed. Not cruelly, just honestly. A delegation of biologists and diplomats had returned from first contact protocols with reports of a species that built ships out of stubbornness as much as metal, that argued among themselves constantly, yet closed ranks instantly against outside threats, and that seemed to measure trust, not in words but in actions repeated over time. One report called them, and I am quoting from memory of a phrase that stuck with me, a species that says less than it means, and means more than it says. We did not understand what that meant. Not really. We thought it meant they were simple. We thought it meant they could be managed. Within 2 years, human engineers had stabilized failing supply routes through the Threnar corridor, a stretch of space so plagued by raiders that 3 other species had simply abandoned trade through it entirely. Humans did not abandon it. They sent patrol craft, quietly, without fanfare, and the raiding stopped within months. When the Council thanked them, the human representative at the time, a calm woman named Dorothy Quinn, simply said that someone had to do it, and left it there. No demand for credit, no request for special status. Just the work. Done. We should have paid closer attention to women and men like Dorothy Quinn. Instead, we filed her report and moved on to the next agenda item. Because there was always a next agenda item, and humanity never seemed to mind waiting at the bottom of the list. That became the pattern. Humans absorbed the unpleasant tasks the rest of the Council preferred to avoid, and the rest of the Council let them, because it was efficient, because it was easy, because nobody complained loudly enough to stop it. I think about a session 3 years before the silence, when the human ambassador, a tall, quiet man named Gregory Lane, stood before the full Council and asked for something modest, not a permanent seat, not special privileges, just fair tariff treatment for human trade convoys, the same rates applied to species who had been members for centuries, instead of the so-called newcomer tax that had been levied against humanity since their arrival, despite the fact that humanity had been propping up half our trade lanes for years by then. I remember the Council's response, polite, sympathetic, and ultimately, nothing. The motion was tabled, then tabled again, then quietly buried under newer business. Gregory Lane did not raise his voice. He did not threaten withdrawal. He simply thanked the Council for its time and sat back down. I assumed, as many of us did, that this meant the matter was settled, that humans would simply continue absorbing the cost, because that was what they always did. I was wrong about so much that day, but I did not know it yet. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs scattered across years of meetings like stones along a path I refused to walk. There was the formal grievance humanity filed about the unequal application of council law, dismissed as a misunderstanding of translated legal terms. There was the request for a permanent advisory seat, denied on the grounds that humanity had not yet demonstrated sufficient cultural integration, despite having integrated more thoroughly into joint fleet operations than half the founding species combined. There was the quiet, persistent pattern of humans doing more and receiving less, year after year, without complaint, until complaint apparently stopped being the point. On the morning the alarms went off, none of that history mattered yet. What mattered was the present, raw and immediate. 41 ships gone and counting, embassies going dark across a dozen worlds, and a silence spreading through council space, like cold water filling a hull. Felicity stayed in my office while I made calls, watching my face the way you watch someone reading bad news about a person you both know. I contacted the human embassy on Council Prime first, because it was closest, because surely someone there could explain, could reassure us, this was a misunderstanding that would resolve itself by midday. The embassy did not answer. I sent a junior officer to the building itself, a modest structure humanity had occupied for 9 years, without ever asking the council to expand or improve it, despite having every right to request better accommodations than they had been given. The officer returned within the hour, with a report that made the silence in my chest grow colder. The embassy was empty, not abandoned in haste, not stripped in panic, but cleaned, organized, and closed, as if the staff had simply finished their shift and walked out the door for the last time, taking nothing they did not need, and leaving nothing behind that did not belong to them. There was a note on the main desk. Felicity read it to me over comms, her voice unsteady. It said only this: "Thank you for the years. We wish you well." 6 words. No explanation, no accusation, no list of grievances, though they certainly had earned the right to write one. Just gratitude, offered freely, even as they walked away from everything we had asked them to carry. I sat with that note for a long time after Felicity finished reading it. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because pretending otherwise would dishonor what came next. I felt insulted, at first. A petty, embarrassing flash of anger that humanity would leave without proper notice, without the formal channels the council expected from its partners. I actually said something to that effect aloud, something about protocol and respect, before Felicity looked at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life. "Respect," she repeated, quietly, and let the words sit there between us, until I understood exactly how foolish I sounded. By midday, the scale of what was happening had become impossible to ignore. Every human ship, on every assignment, in every sector, had received the same recall order at the same moment, suggesting a level of coordination and discipline that should have impressed us, if we had been capable of feeling impressed instead of merely inconvenienced. Patrol craft along the Threnar corridor vanished from their posts. Joint training exercises near the Calder Reach simply stopped, mid-maneuver, as human pilots peeled away from formation without a single transmission to their council counterparts. I received a call from Admiral Charlotte Ames, commander of the Joint Defense Initiative humanity had quietly led for the better part of 4 years, though officially the position had always been held jointly with a council appointee, who, if I am being truthful, contributed considerably less than his human counterpart. Admiral Ames did not sound panicked. She sounded resigned, almost gentle, the way someone sounds when they have made peace with a decision long before announcing it. "We're not coming back today, Coordinator," she said. "I won't pretend I don't understand why you're calling, but there's nothing left for me to say that hasn't already been said, in meetings you didn't attend, in reports you didn't read, for longer than I care to count." I asked her, perhaps too bluntly, whether this was retaliation, whether the council had done something specific to provoke such a complete and sudden withdrawal. Her answer has stayed with me every day since. "It's not retaliation," she said. "It's just the end of patience. There's a difference, and I think you'll understand it eventually, even if today isn't the day." The call ended shortly after that, and I sat alone in my office as the afternoon light shifted across walls that suddenly felt too large for the silence inside them. Outside my window, I could see the orbital lanes that had, until that morning, carried a steady rhythm of human supply ships moving in and out of dock, with the kind of reliability we had stopped noticing, precisely because it never failed. The lanes were empty now. Not damaged, not destroyed, simply empty, the way a house feels empty after someone moves out, even before you've fully understood what is missing. Felicity asked me, near the end of that first impossible day, what I thought would happen next. I did not have an honest answer for her then, though I suspected, somewhere beneath the part of me still clinging to routine and protocol, that the quiet we were sitting in was not peace. It was the held breath, before something far louder began. I told her we would convene an emergency session in the morning, gather every available report, and determine our next steps as a unified council. It sounded confident when I said it. It sounded like the kind of thing a coordinator should say. But as I walked home that evening, past the dark windows of the human embassy, past docking bays that should have hummed with activity, and instead sat silent under the stars, I understood, in a place deeper than protocol, that whatever came next would not be solved with another meeting, another vote, another carefully worded motion tabled for later discussion. Humanity had said everything they needed to say. They had simply chosen, finally, to say it without words at all. The emergency session began at dawn, though dawn meant little inside the artificial light of the council chamber, where representatives from 43 member species gathered around a circular table, built long before humanity ever arrived to fill one of its empty seats. I stood at the center podium with a report I had barely finished compiling, my notes still warm from the printer, and looked out at faces ranging from mildly curious to openly alarmed. Ambassador Helena Brooks, representing the Trade Authority, leaned forward before I had even spoken a full sentence. "Coordinator Voss," she said, "tell us this is contained. Tell us this is a handful of disgruntled officers, not a coordinated withdrawal." I wished I could have told her that. Instead, I laid out the numbers as plainly as I could. Every human vessel, across every sector under council jurisdiction, had departed within the same 6-hour window. Every embassy, every consulate, every liaison office had been vacated in the same orderly, deliberate fashion, with notes left behind that varied only slightly in wording, but never in tone. Gratitude, brevity, finality. A murmur swept the chamber, the kind of sound that comes from dozens of beings realizing the same uncomfortable truth at the same moment. Ambassador Dorian Hale, an elder statesman from one of the founding species, rose slowly to his feet, his expression unreadable beneath the soft light of the chamber. "This is not panic," he said. "This is policy. They planned this." I confirmed what evidence I had, including Admiral Ames's words from the day before, which I repeated carefully, because I sensed even then that they mattered more than anyone in that room wanted to admit. "It's not retaliation," I told them. "It's the end of patience." The chamber did not take that well. Some voices called for immediate diplomatic outreach, formal letters drafted in the careful, layered language the council used for matters of great sensitivity. Others, more pragmatic, called for an assessment of operational gaps, a polite way of asking how much trouble we were actually in. I found myself caught between both conversations, trying to answer practical questions, while the deeper truth of what had happened sat heavy and unspoken beneath every exchange. It was Ambassador Brooks who asked the question that silenced the room. How much of our infrastructure depends on them? Nobody had a complete answer, because nobody had ever bothered to measure it properly. We had absorbed humanity's contributions so gradually, so consistently, that we had stopped seeing them as contributions at all. They had simply become part of the background, like gravity, like starlight, present and reliable, until the precise moment they were not. I was assigned, along with a small delegation, to determine humanity's current location and attempt direct contact. The council wanted answers, wanted reassurance, wanted some path back to the comfortable arrangement we had enjoyed for over a decade without ever fully appreciating it. I accepted the assignment because someone had to, and because some quiet part of me needed to understand what had truly happened, beyond the official statements and the careful diplomatic language. My delegation included Felicity, who insisted on coming despite my objections, along with a logistics officer named Vincent Caro and a translator named Margaret Yates. both of whom had worked closely with human counterparts over the years, and seemed, even then, less surprised by the withdrawal than the rest of the council. We departed within the day aboard a modest council vessel, tracing the last known coordinates of human fleet activity toward the edge of our shared territory. The journey gave me time to think, time I had not allowed myself during the chaos of the emergency session, and what I thought about, mostly, was every interaction I'd had with human representatives over the years, replayed now through a lens I hadn't possessed before. I remembered a junior officer named Walter Briggs, who had served 2 years on a joint patrol near the Calder Reach, without ever once requesting leave, despite clearly having earned it many times over. I remembered asking him, casually, why he never took the time owed to him, and his answer, simple and unbothered, that someone needed to be there, and he didn't mind being that someone. I remembered a logistics coordinator named Eleanor Price, who had quietly redesigned an entire supply chain serving 3 border worlds after the original council system failed catastrophically during a resource shortage, saving thousands of lives, without ever submitting the kind of formal recognition request that would have been entirely justified, given the scale of what she accomplished. These were not isolated incidents. They were the pattern, repeated across hundreds of individuals, thousands of small decisions, until the pattern itself became the foundation upon which much of our shared infrastructure quietly rested. We arrived at the coordinates Admiral Ames had last reported from, a modest outpost near the Threnar corridor that had served as a forward base for joint patrol operations. The outpost was still there, structurally intact, lights still humming along its outer hull, but it was empty. Every console wiped clean, every personal item removed, every trace of the people who had lived and worked there for years, gone as thoroughly as if they had never existed at all. Vincent Caro ran a full scan of the facility, while Margaret Yates attempted to access whatever communication logs remained, though we all suspected, correctly as it turned out, that the logs had been deliberately cleared before departure. Not out of malice, Margaret pointed out, but out of the same quiet discipline humanity had always shown. They were simply finishing the job properly, even on their way out the door. I walked the empty corridors myself, past barracks that had once housed rotating crews of human and council personnel working side by side, past a small recreational area where I remembered, years earlier, sharing an awkward but genuinely warm conversation with a young human technician named Henry Dalton about something as trivial as the merits of different star patterns visible from different worlds. He had laughed at my mispronunciation of a human phrase, not unkindly, and corrected me with patience I hadn't fully appreciated until that moment, walking through the same hallway now and finding it silent. There was nothing hostile in what they had left behind, no warning messages, no traps, no parting insults, just an absence, clean and complete, the kind that spoke louder than any accusation could have. We attempted contact through every channel humanity had previously maintained with the Council, frequencies established years earlier for joint operations, diplomatic backchannels reserved for sensitive matters, even informal contact methods used by officers who had built genuine friendships across species lines during years of shared service. Every attempt returned the same result: silence, clean and absolute, broadcast back to us across empty space. Margaret suggested, carefully, that the silence itself might be the message, that humanity had said everything they intended to say through the note left in their embassy, and that further attempts at contact might simply be ignored until humanity decided otherwise, if they ever did. I did not want to accept that, not yet, and pushed the delegation toward the edge of charted territory, following rumors and fragments of information toward what little remained of human-held space within Council jurisdiction. What we found there told us more than any official statement could have. A small colony world, modest in size, populated primarily by human families who had built lives there over the better part of a decade, sat eerily quiet beneath a sky that should have carried the hum of agricultural drones and the distant sound of children at play. The colony had not been abandoned in haste. Homes stood intact, gardens still tended in their final days, streets clean and orderly. But the people themselves were simply gone, transported away with the same quiet, coordinated efficiency that had marked every other human departure across Council space. I spoke with a Council liaison officer who had remained behind, a being named Cassian Wren, who had served the colony for years and had been informed of the departure only hours before it happened. With no further explanation offered, beyond a polite request, that he relay one final message to the council upon our arrival. Cassian delivered that message to me personally, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't expected from someone who, by all accounts, had no particular loyalty to humanity beyond professional duty. "They ask me to tell you that this isn't about punishment," he said. "They ask me to tell you that they simply stopped believing the council would ever change and decided to stop waiting for proof otherwise." I asked him if he believed that was the full truth, and he considered the question for a long moment before answering honestly. "I believe they're tired, Coordinator. I believe they gave more than anyone asked them to give, for longer than anyone bothered to notice, and eventually, even patience like that runs out." We returned to council space without the answers our superiors had hoped for, carrying instead a growing understanding that this withdrawal was neither temporary nor reversible through the usual channels of diplomacy and negotiation. Humanity had not left in anger, not in the dramatic, confrontational way the council might have understood and responded to through familiar protocols. They had left in the quietest way possible, the way someone leaves a relationship they have already grieved long before announcing the decision aloud. During the return journey, I found myself increasingly unable to ignore the practical consequences beginning to ripple across council space. Consequences that had nothing to do with sentiment or regret, and everything to do with the sudden, gaping holes left behind in systems we had taken entirely for granted. Vincent received reports, fragmented at first but growing more urgent by the hour, of disruptions across the very systems humanity had quietly maintained for years. Supply convoys along routes humans had once patrolled began reporting delays, then losses, as the absence of consistent security allowed old threats to resurface with alarming speed. A shipping consortium operating near the Threnar corridor reported its first raid in over 3 years within 40 hours of the human withdrawal, a fact that struck me with particular force, given how thoroughly we had assumed that threat permanently neutralized. Margaret, reviewing communications traffic from across the council network, noted a sharp rise in distress calls from border territories that had relied, knowingly or not, on the quiet presence of human patrol craft to deter exactly the kind of incursions now beginning to multiply. These were not isolated incidents. They were the first cracks in a foundation we had never properly examined, now visible only because the weight humanity had been silently bearing was finally gone. I sat alone in my quarters during the final stretch of our return journey, reviewing everything we had gathered, everything we had witnessed, and found myself returning again and again to Cassian Wren's words. They simply stopped believing the council would ever change. I wanted to argue with that assessment, to insist that the council had always valued humanity's contributions, had always intended fair treatment eventually, had simply been slow rather than dismissive. But sitting there, surrounded by reports of resurging threats and abandoned outposts, I could not honestly construct that argument, not even for myself. We had been slow, yes, but slowness sustained over a decade is not an accident. It is a choice, repeated often enough to become a pattern, and patterns repeated long enough eventually become identity. The council had not simply failed to act quickly enough on humanity's behalf. The council had decided, again and again, in small votes and tabled motions, and quietly buried grievances, that humanity's patience was a resource to be spent, rather than a gift to be honored. By the time we docked back at Council Prime, the emergency session already reconvening to address the growing list of disruptions across our territory, I understood that whatever came next would require more than careful diplomatic language and formal letters of reconciliation. It would require the Council to confront, honestly and completely, exactly how much we had relied upon a species we had never properly valued, and exactly how steep the cost of that oversight was about to become. Felicity walked beside me toward the chamber, quiet for once, her earlier energy replaced by something heavier, more contemplative. As we approached the entrance, she asked me a question I did not have a comfortable answer for. "Do you think they'll ever come back, Coordinator?" I looked toward the chamber doors, toward the gathering representatives, already arguing among themselves about response strategies and contingency plans, none of which, I suspected, would address the actual problem at the heart of everything unfolding around us. "I don't know," I told her honestly, "but I think we're about to find out exactly what we lost in the meantime." 3 weeks after the withdrawal, I stood on the observation deck of a council cruiser above the mining colony of Bellwether Station, watching smoke rise from a refinery that had burned through the night because no defense force arrived in time to stop the raiders who struck it. I had requested to be present for the relief operation personally, partly out of duty, partly because I needed to see with my own eyes what the reports could only describe in cold statistics. Bellwether had never been a wealthy colony, but it had been a steady one, producing rare minerals that fed half the council's shipbuilding industry, protected for years by a rotating human patrol that maintained a presence so consistent the colonists had stopped thinking of it as protection at all. It had simply become part of the rhythm of their lives, like weather, like sunrise. That patrol was gone now, reassigned to nothing, replaced by nobody, and the raiders who struck Bellwether knew it. They came in fast, hit the refinery and 2 residential blocks before any council response could be organized, and were gone again, before our hastily assembled defense fleet even arrived in system. I walked through the wreckage with a relief coordinator named Daniel Forsyth, who had spent the better part of a decade working alongside human patrol officers on exactly this kind of colony, and his anger, quiet and controlled as it was, cut through me more than any official report could have. "We knew this would happen," he said, stepping over a fallen support beam still smoldering at its edges. "Everyone who actually worked the border knew this would happen the moment those patrols stopped. It wasn't a secret. It was just inconvenient to say out loud in a council session." I asked him how long the colony had gone without proper defense before the attack, and his answer confirmed what I had begun to suspect from the broader pattern of reports flooding in from across our territory. 19 days. 19 days between the human withdrawal and the first attack on a colony that, for nearly 6 years, had not experienced a single serious incursion. 19 days was apparently all it took for threats long suppressed to remember they had once been threats at all. Bellwether was not unique. By the end of that month, similar incidents had occurred along nearly every border zone humanity had previously patrolled, each one following the same pattern: a period of eerie calm, followed by escalating probing actions from opportunistic raiders testing the new reality, followed eventually by a full incursion once it became clear no meaningful resistance would arrive in time. The council scrambled to respond, reallocating existing fleet resources, drafting emergency defense budgets, even attempting to recruit volunteer forces from member species who had never previously contributed meaningfully to border security. I sat through session after session watching well-meaning representatives propose solutions that sounded reasonable on paper and fell apart the moment anyone examined the practical details. Ambassador Brooks proposed redistributing existing council fleet assets to cover the gaps left by human withdrawal, a sensible idea undermined entirely by the simple fact that council fleets had never been sized to cover those gaps in the first place, precisely because humanity had always quietly absorbed the difference. Ambassador Hale proposed accelerated shipbuilding programs to expand overall fleet capacity, a solution that might address the problem eventually, perhaps in 3 or 4 years, while colonies like Bellwether burned in the meantime. I found myself, during one particularly heated session, finally voicing the frustration I had been carrying since my return from the abandoned outpost weeks earlier. "We are trying to replace something we never properly measured," I said, interrupting a debate over fleet allocation percentages that had dragged on for nearly an hour without producing anything resembling a workable conclusion. "We don't know how much humanity was actually doing, because we never bothered to find out. We assumed it would always be there, the way you assume gravity will always hold you to the ground, until suddenly it doesn't, and you realize you never understood how much you depended on it." The chamber went quiet for a moment, and Ambassador Hale, to his credit, did not dismiss the point. "Then perhaps," he said slowly, "our first task should be understanding exactly what we lost, before we try to replace it with guesses." That session marked a shift in how the council approached the crisis, moving from reactive scrambling toward a more deliberate effort to assess the true scope of human contribution across every sector of council operations. I was assigned, alongside a small research team, to compile a comprehensive review, and what we uncovered over the following weeks painted a picture far more extensive than any of us had anticipated. Vincent Caro, still working alongside me from the earlier delegation, took point on the logistics analysis, and his findings were sobering. Human-controlled supply lines had accounted for nearly a third of all interspecies trade movement across contested border regions, a figure far higher than official council records suggested, largely because humanity had absorbed inefficiencies in the existing system, rather than reporting them as problems requiring council intervention. They had simply solved issues quietly, on their own initiative, without waiting for committee approval or budget allocation, because waiting would have meant colonies going without supplies in the meantime. Margaret Yates, reviewing diplomatic and security records, uncovered an even more uncomfortable pattern. Over the preceding 6 years, human forces had intercepted or deterred no fewer than 43 serious security threats across council territory, ranging from organized raiding operations to at least 2 incidents involving hostile incursions from beyond council borders entirely, threats that had never escalated into full crises, specifically because human patrols neutralized them before they could. None of these incidents had been widely publicized. Humanity, true to the pattern I had begun to recognize across every interaction I reviewed, had simply handled each threat and moved on, rarely requesting formal recognition, rarely even submitting detailed reports beyond what operational protocol strictly required. They had not wanted credit. They had wanted the problem solved, and considered that sufficient reward in itself. I began compiling testimonies from council officials and colonists across dozens of worlds who had worked alongside human personnel over the years, hoping to better understand not just the practical contributions humanity had made, but the deeper pattern of behavior that had led to their eventual departure. What I gathered painted a portrait of a species that had given consistently, patiently, and almost entirely without complaint, even as the council repeatedly failed to reciprocate that generosity in any meaningful way. A colony administrator named Beatrice Hollis described an incident from 4 years earlier, when a fever outbreak swept through her settlement faster than local medical resources could contain. A human relief vessel diverted from its scheduled patrol route without waiting for council authorization, delivering medical supplies and trained personnel within hours, rather than the days it would have taken through official channels. When Beatrice later attempted to formally commend the crew through council records, her request was delayed for months by procedural review, then ultimately filed without further action, lost among hundreds of similar commendations that the council apparently considered too minor to prioritize. A shipping captain named Roger Finch described years of working alongside human escort vessels through dangerous trade routes, describing their professionalism and reliability with a kind of quiet reverence that surprised me, given how rarely traders expressed such sentiment about military escorts of any kind. He recalled one incident where a human vessel had taken significant damage protecting his convoy from an ambush, continuing the escort mission anyway, rather than diverting for repairs, because abandoning the convoy mid-route would have left it exposed. When he later asked the human captain why she hadn't simply requested replacement escort and returned to dock, her answer, relayed to me secondhand but striking nonetheless, was simple. She said someone had to finish the job, and she didn't see why it shouldn't be her. These stories accumulated by the dozens, then the hundreds, each one reinforcing the same uncomfortable truth. Humanity had not simply been a useful ally to the council. They had been, in many practical respects, the foundation upon which significant portions of our shared security and stability had quietly rested, absorbing risk and hardship that other species, including my own, had largely been spared from experiencing directly. I brought these findings before the full council, in a session that I knew, even before presenting it, would be difficult for many representatives to hear. I laid out the numbers as plainly as I could, the intercepted threats, the absorbed logistics burdens, the countless small acts of generosity that had never been properly acknowledged or reciprocated, and watched the chamber grow steadily quieter, as the scope of what we had lost became impossible to dismiss as exaggeration or sentiment. Ambassador Brooks, who had been among the most dismissive voices during earlier sessions, sat in unusually long silence before finally speaking. "We treated their patients like an unlimited resource," she said, more to herself than to the chamber at large. "We never once considered that it might run out." Ambassador Hale, his earlier skepticism replaced now with something closer to genuine concern, asked the question that had been sitting unspoken beneath every report I'd presented. "What do we do now, Coordinator? Assuming they won't simply return because we've finally noticed what we lost." I did not have a confident answer for him, not then. I told the chamber honestly that rebuilding trust, if it was even possible at this point, would require more than apology. more than formal letters or symbolic gestures. It would require the Council to fundamentally change how it treated its members, not just humanity should they ever return, but every species whose contributions had been quietly taken for granted in similar, if less dramatic ways over the years. The session ended without a clear resolution, as so many had during that period, but something had shifted nonetheless. The conversation was no longer about logistics gaps or fleet allocation percentages. It had become, finally, about the deeper failure at the heart of everything unfolding around us. A failure not of resources or strategy, but of basic respect, extended too rarely and far too late. I left the chamber that evening and walked, almost without deciding to, toward the now permanently empty human embassy that still stood near the heart of Council Prime. The Council had not yet decided what to do with the building, whether to repurpose it or preserve it, and so it remained exactly as humanity had left it, clean and orderly and silent. I stood outside for a long while, looking up at the modest structure that had housed a species capable of so much quiet generosity, and thought about Gregory Lane standing before the Council years earlier, asking politely for nothing more than fair treatment, and being told, in effect, to wait. We had asked humanity to wait, again and again, for years, never once stopping to consider that patience, however vast, is not the same as infinite tolerance. Somewhere along the way, without a single dramatic confrontation, without a single threat or ultimatum, humanity had simply finished waiting. And now, standing in the shadow of everything that absence had already cost us, with reports of fresh incursions and resurging threats arriving daily from border worlds across our territory, I understood that the true nightmare the Council now faced was not humanity's eventual return, however uncertain that remained. It was the very real possibility that they never would. 2 months into the crisis, I received a personal message that had nothing to do with official Council business, and everything to do with the part of this story I had not yet allowed myself to fully feel. The message came from a woman named Caroline Whitmore, a human engineer I had worked alongside years earlier, during a joint infrastructure project rebuilding a damaged transit hub near the Outer Rim. We had spent nearly 8 months in close cooperation during that project, and though I would not have called us close friends at the time, there had been a genuine warmth between us, the kind that grows naturally between people who solve difficult problems together under pressure. I had not heard from Caroline since the withdrawal, and given everything else happening, I had assumed, perhaps unfairly, that whatever connection we'd built had simply been another casualty of humanity's departure. The message itself was brief, sent through a relay channel I did not recognize, and it contained no return address, no way to respond. She wrote that she had heard, through channels she did not specify, that I had been asking questions, gathering testimonies, trying to understand what had happened, rather than simply demanding humanity's return. She wrote that this mattered to her, more than she expected it to, and that she wanted me to understand something the Council had perhaps never grasped about the people who built and crewed those ships. It was never about the work, she wrote. We didn't mind the work. What we minded was being treated as though the work was all we were good for. I read that message more times than I can count over the following days, sitting with it during quiet moments between sessions, turning it over in my mind, alongside everything else I had learned. Caroline's words crystallized something I had been circling for weeks without quite naming directly. The Council had not simply failed to reward humanity's contributions. We had, in 1,000 small ways, communicated that we did not see those contributions as coming from people at all, but from a resource, reliable and self-sustaining, that required no particular care or consideration beyond ensuring it remained operational. I thought about every interaction I had reviewed during the research phase, every testimony Margaret and Vincent had gathered, and realized they all carried the same undercurrent beneath the specific details. Humans who diverted from assignments to help colonies in crisis. Humans who absorbed logistics burdens without complaint. Humans who intercepted threats quietly and moved on without seeking recognition. In every single case, the Council's response had been gratitude expressed briefly, if at all, followed swiftly by an assumption that such generosity would simply continue indefinitely, without need for reciprocal investment or genuine partnership. We had not built a relationship with humanity. We had built a dependency, one-sided and largely unacknowledged, and called it an alliance because the word sounded better in official records. Around this same time, an incident occurred that forced even the most reluctant members of the council to confront the full weight of what we had lost, in terms far more immediate and personal than abstract reports or compiled statistics. A passenger transport carrying nearly 600 civilians, traveling a route that had been considered entirely safe for years, under the protection of human patrols, came under sustained attack from a raiding group, operating with a level of coordination and aggression that suggested they had been planning the assault for some time, waiting specifically for the security gap humanity's withdrawal had created. I was in session when the distress call came through, and I remember the particular quality of silence that fell over the chamber as the situation unfolded in real time across the main display, transmitted from a nearby council patrol vessel that had been first to respond, but lacked the firepower or coordination to mount an effective defense alone. The patrol vessel's captain, a young officer named Patrick Sloan, requested immediate reinforcement, his voice carrying a controlled panic that cut through the chamber more effectively than any report could have. Reinforcements were dispatched, but the nearest available fleet assets were over 2 hours away, a gap that, 18 months earlier, would have been covered without question by human patrol craft stationed precisely to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe. For nearly 90 minutes, we watched, helpless, as Captain Sloan's single vessel attempted to shield the transport, taking damage that grew steadily more severe with each passing exchange. I will not describe every detail of what unfolded during those 90 minutes, because I do not believe dwelling on it serves any purpose beyond causing unnecessary distress. But I will say that by the time reinforcements finally arrived and the raiders withdrew, the cost had already been paid in ways that no after-action report could fully capture. The transport survived, badly damaged but largely intact, thanks almost entirely to Captain Sloan's refusal to abandon his position, despite mounting losses. But the incident sent a wave of fear through council space, unlike anything the earlier border skirmishes had produced, because it demonstrated clearly, in front of the entire chamber, exactly how thin the margin between safety and catastrophe had become, without humanity's quiet presence holding that margin steady. Ambassador Hale called for an immediate full session following the incident, and the tone of that gathering was unlike anything I had witnessed during my years of service. Representatives who had previously approached the crisis with careful diplomatic detachment now spoke with open urgency, even fear, as the reality of our collective vulnerability settled fully into the chamber for the first time. I was asked to present my findings once more, this time before an audience far more willing to listen than during my earlier presentations. I spoke not just of logistics gaps and intercepted threats, but of Caroline Whitmore's message, of the deeper failure at the heart of everything that had happened. I told the chamber, as directly as I could manage, that we were not facing a temporary security gap that could be solved through fleet reallocation or accelerated shipbuilding programs alone. We were facing the consequences of having spent over a decade treating a partner as a resource, and the only path forward, if one existed at all, required us to fundamentally reconsider not just our relationship with humanity, but our entire approach to every member species whose contributions we had similarly undervalued over the years. Ambassador Brooks, visibly shaken by the events surrounding the transport attack, asked a question that I had been waiting for someone to voice for weeks. Is there any indication they might be willing to discuss reconciliation, given everything that's happened? Or have we lost that possibility entirely? I did not have a definitive answer, but I shared what little information I had managed to gather through informal channels over the preceding weeks. Caroline's message, brief and unofficial as it was, suggested that at least some individuals within humanity's withdrawal remained reachable, remained willing to engage, provided any approach came from genuine understanding rather than mere desperation to restore lost convenience. Cassian Wren, the liaison officer I had spoken with during my earlier visit to the abandoned colony, had also continued sending periodic updates, gathered through contacts he maintained independently of official council channels. According to his most recent report, humanity had not simply scattered randomly after their withdrawal, but had consolidated within a region of space they had quietly developed over the preceding years, largely unknown to the council, suggesting a level of foresight and preparation that put to rest any lingering assumption that the withdrawal had been impulsive or poorly considered. This was not a species in crisis, scrambling to survive after abandoning their obligations. This was a species that had planned a deliberate, dignified departure, executed with the same quiet competence they had brought to every task the council had ever asked of them, and had simply chosen, finally, to direct that competence toward building something of their own, free from a relationship that had never adequately valued what they brought to it. I proposed, before the full chamber, that the council formally draft a delegation intended not to demand humanity's return, but to acknowledge, honestly and without conditions, the full scope of what we had failed to provide during the years of partnership. I argued that any approach centered primarily on restoring lost convenience would almost certainly fail, given everything we now understood about why humanity had left in the first place, and that genuine reconciliation, if it remained possible at all, would require the council to demonstrate real change rather than simply request humanity's continued sacrifice under slightly improved terms. The proposal sparked significant debate, with some representatives still clinging to the hope that a sufficiently generous offer might convince humanity to return quickly, restoring the comfortable arrangement we had grown so dependent upon. I understood that impulse, even as I argued against it, because I shared the same desire for a quick resolution to a crisis that grew more dangerous with each passing week. But Caroline's words stayed with me throughout that debate, a quiet counterweight to every argument suggesting we simply needed the right incentive package to bring humanity back into the fold. It was never about the work. It was about being seen as more than the work. The council ultimately voted, by a narrow but genuine margin, to approve formation of a reconciliation delegation, tasked not with negotiating humanity's immediate return, but with formally acknowledging the council's failures and beginning what promised to be a long, uncertain process of rebuilding trust that had been worn away over more than a decade of accumulated neglect. I was asked to lead that delegation, given my involvement throughout the crisis, and I accepted, though not without significant apprehension about what we might find, or fail to find, when we finally attempted to reach whatever remained of humanity's presence beyond the borders we had once shared. As preparations for the delegation began, I found myself returning once more to Caroline's message, reading it again in the quiet hours before departure, searching for some sign of hope buried within her careful, measured words. I found something, eventually, in the final line she had written, a sentence I had read many times already, but only fully understood in that moment. We left quietly, because we wanted to leave room for you to understand, without us needing to shout. Whether you use that room well is entirely up to you now. I did not know, as our delegation prepared to depart Council Prime, whether we would use that room well, or squander it as thoroughly as we had squandered every prior opportunity for genuine partnership. But I understood, finally, that the nightmare the council now faced was not simply the practical consequence of humanity's absence, the resurging threats and strained resources that had dominated every conversation since their departure. The true nightmare was the possibility that we had learned this lesson too late to matter, that whatever room Caroline's words described might already be closing, and that humanity, having finally found peace in their quiet departure, might have no reason left to ever look back toward a council that had taken so long to understand what it had been given, and so much longer still to understand what it had lost. Our delegation ship crossed the last charted boundary of council space, 11 days after departing Council Prime, moving into a region the navigational charts simply labeled as unclaimed, though Cassian Wren's intelligence suggested otherwise entirely. I stood on the bridge alongside Felicity, Vincent, and Margaret, all four of us watching the forward display as our pilot, a steady and unflappable officer named Charles Dunmore, guided us carefully through coordinates that had never officially appeared on any council survey. The silence on the bridge carried a different quality than the silence I had grown accustomed to during the previous 2 months, less heavy with dread, more charged with uncertain anticipation. We had sent advance notice of our approach through the relay channel Caroline Whitmore had used to contact me, along with a formal statement Margaret had helped draft, careful and deliberately humble, acknowledging the council's failures without demanding anything in return, beyond the opportunity to deliver that acknowledgement directly. We had received no confirmation that the message had even reached its intended recipients, and so we traveled forward without any guarantee of welcome, carrying only the hope that Caroline's words about leaving room for understanding had been sincere. 3 hours into unclaimed space, our sensors detected the first sign that we were no longer alone. A single human vessel appeared on our scanners, holding position roughly 12,000 kilometers off our starboard bow, making no aggressive maneuvers, offering no communication, simply present, watching, the way a sentry watches an approaching traveler whose intentions remain unconfirmed. Charles reduced our speed immediately, and I ordered all weapons systems held in standby, unarmed, visible on our outgoing transponder signal, as a clear demonstration that we had come without hostile intent. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing happened beyond the quiet hum of our own engines and the steady, unblinking presence of that distant vessel. Then, without warning, a transmission request appeared on our communication console, routed through an encryption protocol I did not recognize, requesting visual contact, rather than the standard text-based exchange Council vessels typically used for first contact in uncertain situations. I authorized the connection myself, and the display flickered briefly before resolving into the image of a woman I recognized immediately, despite the months that had passed since I last saw her in person. Admiral Charlotte Ames regarded me with an expression that was neither hostile nor especially welcoming, simply measured, the look of someone reserving judgment, until she understood exactly why we had come. "Coordinator Voss," she said, "I'll admit, I didn't expect the Council to send anyone this far, especially not you personally." I told her, as plainly as I could manage, that we had come to deliver an acknowledgement the Council should have offered years earlier, and that I had insisted on leading the delegation myself because I believed the message deserved to be delivered by someone who had personally witnessed the cost of our failures, rather than relayed through layers of formal diplomatic language that might dilute its sincerity. Admiral Ames listened without interrupting as I explained the purpose of our visit, watching me carefully through the display, her expression giving little away beyond careful attention. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "You understand," she said, "that an apology, however sincere, doesn't undo what's already happened. Bellwether Station, that transport attack, the colonies that have suffered because the Council waited too long to value what it had." I told her I understood that completely, and that we had not come expecting forgiveness or immediate restoration of the partnership that had existed before. We had come because Caroline Whitmore had suggested, through a message I still carried with me, that humanity had left room for the Council to understand, and I wanted to honor that room honestly, regardless of what came after. Admiral Ames's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Caroline's name, something softening briefly before her measured composure returned. "Caroline reached out to you," she said, not quite a question. "She didn't mention that to me directly, though I suspected as much when your message arrived through that particular relay. She granted our delegation permission to proceed toward a coordinate she transmitted directly to our navigation system, instructing us to maintain current speed and avoid any sudden maneuvers, given the heightened security posture humanity had maintained since their withdrawal." I agreed without hesitation, and our ship continued forward under the watchful escort of Admiral Ames's vessel, accompanied now by 2 additional human craft that had appeared from positions previously hidden from our sensors entirely. The journey toward humanity's new territory took another full day, during which I had considerable time to consider exactly what I hoped to accomplish, and exactly what I feared we might find waiting for us at its conclusion. Felicity, usually so quick to fill silence with conversation, remained unusually quiet throughout most of the journey, and when I finally asked what was troubling her, her answer surprised me with its directness. "I keep wondering if we're already too late," she said, "not for the apology, for whatever comes after it. What if they've already built something better than what they had with us, and an apology is just us asking them to give that up again?" It was a fair question, one I had asked myself in quieter moments throughout the journey, and I did not have a confident answer to offer her, only honesty about my own uncertainty. We arrived at the designated coordinates shortly after the journey's final day began, and what greeted us on our display silenced every remaining conversation aboard our ship entirely. Humanity had not simply scattered into hiding after their withdrawal from Council space. They had built, in the relatively short time since their departure, a functioning settlement of considerable scale, anchored around a central station that hummed with the kind of organized activity I remembered from their best-maintained outposts within Council territory, but expanded now to a scope that suggested years of preparation rather than months of hasty construction. Vincent, studying the scans with visible disbelief, confirmed what I had already begun to suspect from the sheer scale of infrastructure visible across the system. This had not been built in the 8 weeks since the withdrawal. Foundational elements, shipyards, agricultural domes, defensive installations, showed signs of construction stretching back considerably further, suggesting that humanity's departure had been planned not in panic or sudden frustration, but over a much longer period, quietly, patiently, exactly as Cassian Wren had suggested weeks earlier. We had spent years assuming humanity's patience meant contentment with the arrangement we offered them. In truth, that patience had simply been the careful, deliberate process of building somewhere they would no longer need to ask for fair treatment they were owed but never received. Our ship was guided to a docking position aboard the central station, and I disembarked alongside Felicity, Vincent, and Margaret, met on the platform by Admiral Ames herself, standing alongside several other officials I recognized from years of joint council operations, including, to my genuine relief, Caroline Whitmore, standing slightly apart from the formal welcoming party, with an expression that carried more warmth than I had dared to hope for. The formal proceedings that followed took place in a modest meeting hall, rather than anything resembling the grand chambers the council typically reserved for diplomatic occasions, a deliberate choice, I suspected, that humanity had made to keep the conversation honest rather than ceremonial. I delivered the acknowledgement we had prepared, speaking plainly about every failure I had uncovered during my months of investigation, the tariffs never properly addressed, the recognition never properly given, the countless small moments where the council had chosen convenience over genuine partnership, and the catastrophic cost that choice had ultimately produced for colonies and individuals across our shared territory. I did not ask, during that address, for humanity's immediate return to council space. I had decided, during the long journey to reach them, that requesting such a thing too quickly would only repeat the same fundamental error that had driven them away in the first place, treating their presence as something owed to us, rather than something earned, through genuine respect, sustained consistently over time. When I finished speaking, the hall remained quiet for several long moments before Admiral Ames rose to respond, her expression carrying a complexity I had not seen from her during our earlier exchange aboard ship. "We didn't leave because we stopped caring about the people we worked alongside," she said. "Officers like you, coordinator, individuals who treated us as partners rather than tools. We left because individual decency, however genuine, couldn't outweigh a system that consistently failed to value what we contributed. That's not something one apology fixes, however sincere it is." I told her I understood that completely, and that the council was prepared to demonstrate genuine, sustained change, not as a condition for humanity's return, but as a commitment we owed, regardless of whether that return ever happened. Caroline stepped forward at that point, addressing me directly for the first time since our arrival. "What would that change actually look like, coordinator? Specific terms, not just intentions." I laid out, as honestly as I could, the reforms the council had begun drafting during my absence. Fair tariff structures applied equally, regardless of membership tenure. Formal mechanisms for recognizing contributions that had previously gone unacknowledged. Genuine representation in council decision-making, proportional to actual contribution, rather than arbitrary cultural integration standards that had been used for years to justify exclusion. None of it would happen overnight, I acknowledged, and none of it guaranteed humanity's trust would be restored quickly, if at all. The hall remained quiet following my explanation, humanity's representatives exchanging glances I could not fully interpret, weighing considerations I suspected went far beyond what had been said aloud in that room. Admiral Ames finally spoke again, her tone measured but no longer entirely guarded. "We're not making any promises today, coordinator. Not about returning, not about resuming the arrangement we had before. What I can tell you is that we'll consider what you've brought us honestly, and we'll watch whether the changes you've described actually happen, rather than simply being discussed in another committee that quietly buries them later." It was not the resolution I had hoped to bring back to the council, not the triumphant restoration of partnership that would have made for a tidy conclusion to everything that had unfolded over the preceding months. But it was honest, and I had come to understand, through everything I had learned during this crisis, that honesty mattered considerably more than comfortable resolution, particularly when comfortable resolution had been exactly what allowed the Council's failures to accumulate unchecked for over a decade in the first place. Before our delegation departed, Caroline approached me privately, away from the formal proceedings, and spoke with the same directness that had characterized her message weeks earlier. "I'm glad you came yourself," she said. "I'm glad you took the time to actually understand, rather than just sending another formal request through official channels. Whatever happens next, that matters more than you probably realize." I asked her, honestly, whether she believed humanity would eventually return to some form of partnership with the Council, and her answer, careful and considered, has stayed with me through every day since. "I don't know," she said. "I think it depends entirely on whether the Council remembers this lesson once the immediate crisis fades, or whether it slides back into old habits the moment things feel comfortable again. That's the real test, coordinator. Not today. Years from now, when it would be easy to forget." Our delegation departed humanity's territory the following morning, carrying no formal commitment, no guaranteed timeline for reconciliation, only the cautious possibility that genuine change, sustained over time, might eventually rebuild what years of neglect had broken. I returned to Council Prime and delivered my report honestly, including every uncertainty, every unresolved question, refusing to soften the outcome into something more reassuring than what we had actually achieved. The Council, to its credit, began implementing the reforms we had discussed, slowly at first, then with growing consistency as the practical consequences of humanity's absence continued reminding every representative exactly what genuine partnership had actually been worth. Whether those reforms would prove sufficient, whether humanity would ever choose to return, whether the relationship could ever be fully restored after everything that had been lost, none of these questions had clear answers in the months following our delegation's return. I still think, often, about Caroline's final words to me, about the real test lying not in the immediate crisis, but in whatever came years afterward, once comfort and convenience tempted the Council back toward the same patterns that had driven humanity away in the first place. I think about Bellwether Station, about Captain Sloane's 90 minutes of desperate defense, about the abandoned outpost, where I first understood exactly how thoroughly humanity had departed without ever raising their voice. And I think, most often, about that single note left behind in their empty embassy, 6 words that had seemed, on that first impossible morning, like such a small thing to carry the full weight of everything that followed. "Thank you for the years. We wish you well. I understand now, in a way I could not have understood before everything that crisis taught me, that those 6 words were never truly an ending. They were a question, quiet and patient, left hanging in the silence humanity's departure created, waiting to see whether the Council would finally become the kind of partner worth returning to, or whether we would simply let that silence stretch on, undisturbed, until it became permanent. The galaxy's true nightmare, I have come to believe, was never humanity's arrival, however unsettling that first contact briefing once seemed, to representatives who underestimated exactly what kind of species had just entered our shared space. The true nightmare was always the possibility that we would fail to recognize their worth, until after they had already, quietly and without complaint, decided to walk away. Whether we have learned that lesson in time remains, even now, an open question. But for the first time since that silent morning, when 41 ships vanished without a word, I find myself willing to hope that the answer, eventually, might be yes.